Hi there. So in week 10, we're going to cover a few things pretty directly related to listening and understanding. Um, Pretty specifically in the sense that we're going to dive into what active listening is in a little more depth and talk about a couple of ways that it might be practiced and it might be understood a little bit differently. So some of you mentioned having a little bit of a hard time understanding the expectations for the activity for the Festival of the Young Child. So I pushed the due date for the description of that activity back a week. So that's going to be due at the end of this week. And just to kind of recap what it is, although the festival itself has been canceled, Dr. Sparks and Dr. Tanyel are both working together to figure out an alternative event at which you all might be able to lead that activity that you're designing. And so the activity should be a little like a quick, not overly quick, but a relatively short class activity. So like a game or some kind of dance or song if you're involving music. And I've asked you to focus in on either communication, empathy and emotion, and or you're going to mix it up, music. And so try to base your activity around one of those themes, one or more of those themes, and aim at young children and their families being able to participate in it with you. Okay? So that's going to be a kind of TBA for now, because I don't know what the event will look like, but at some point we'll have something where you'll be able to demonstrate that and guide young children and their families in that short activity you're designing. So go online, look at Pinterest and stuff like that, other school teacher related sites that share activities like that and things to get some ideas, okay? And the point again is for me to see some creativity in the ways that you put those themes to use, put them into practice so that they can be an entertaining and engaging way for children and their families to interact with themselves and with you. All right? So the door is open, of course, to ask me more questions about that if it's still not quite clear, but you have this week to finish it up. And I would like for you to pair up with other people, pair up or group up with other classmates. If you're finding it that to be very difficult to do, either contacting people or meeting with them, then you're able to do it on your own. But do try to team up with others so that we don't have an abundance of activities. We'd rather have a few really good ones than a lot of people kind of standing on their own, leading to possible overlap and repeating and things like that. Okay, so on to the lesson today. You're going to have one practice assignment, which is a discussion post, and one reply to another student, and then a two-part demonstrate activity. And this week also is, at the end of this week, is also the due date for your children's book annotated bibliography. So that's a list of children's books that might be aimed at diverse audiences. And annotation shouldn't be too incredibly long, just a short paragraph or so explaining the content of the book, what demographic of people it might be aimed at, useful or interesting parts about it that led you to the book, things like that, the ways that it might be useful in your future career. Okay, so the topic of our discussion for this week includes ways of listening and ways of understanding. So just different ways we might be able to take on certain attitudes or be able to filter our conversations with others in such a way that we get different impressions. And then we're going to talk more in detail about active listening and how to practice it. We've kind of gone over the surface of it a little bit, but I'm going to really dive in deeper to each of the components. So I've outlined 3 ways of listening. Now there's numberless ways of listening that we might be able to think about. But these are 3 ways that can help us understand how we're approaching another person. So one is content listening. That basically focuses in on exactly what is being said. Just the words, just the information. Leaving out lots of other things that have to do with the person's their context, their history, their unspoken things, think of it as literal. Okay, that's content listening. Sometimes that's really necessary. However, at a little bit of a deeper level, delivery listening might be thought of as being paying attention to how something is being said. So this draws in nonverbals, facial expression, tone of voice, eye contact or eye direction, things like that. And it gives a different flavor to what's being said. It kind of tints it with a certain color so that it means something slightly or subtly different than it might be if it were taken at face value. Okay, so you can actually see this at work if you've ever sent or received a text message that was taken the wrong way, and it's probably happened to many of you quite a number of times. But if that's done, the purpose, or the reason for that rather, is likely that there's a lot missing that in delivery listening we get or we receive, like those things that I mentioned a minute ago, tone of voice and facial expression, inflection of tone, things like that, that emphasizes different parts of the sentence that's being spoken, and that actually leads to a different meaning altogether. Okay. So, then what might be thought of as even a deeper level of listening than delivery listening is what we could call process listening. Now, in addition to the actual information that's being said, the words spoken, and also in addition to the emotional value that's placed on one thing or another in what's being said, given the facial expressions, tone of voice, inflection, we're also thinking about what's not being said. And you can think about what's being left out, what ways in which the conversation's moving one direction or another, and it's called process listening because we're actually thinking about we're listening to how we're listening in a certain sense. Okay, so an example of what this might be like is if you're thinking about something, that's pretty direct. You're having a thought about something, but if you're thinking about how you're thinking about that thing, right? And it's a little wordy there to talk about it, but that's what process listening is like. We're paying attention to how we pay attention in a conversation. We're listening to how we're listening in a certain sense. And so that's something worth experimenting with. How am I listening to this person means something like, what am I filtering out that I could notice about what they're saying? And what am I adding in that isn't necessarily a part of what's being said? Okay? And as we listen in different ways, we're going to come to understand others and ourselves in different ways. And one way we might do that is to understand someone else as others might see them. And in a certain way, that's a little like stereotyping. We might picture or see a person and then have a representation of what that person is probably like in general, and especially according to others. And that's a pretty surface level way of understanding people. It is sometimes extremely necessary and extremely helpful, but it's also sometimes pretty hindering and a little bit harmful at times. Sometimes we have to make really quick assessments or evaluations of the situations we find ourselves in, and sometimes a quick and dirty kind of take on someone or a situation is really useful. However, if we have the time and we want to dive in or delve into another person and how they are and understand them more deeply, we can understand them as we see them. Okay, and that can bring a lot of benefit to the conversation. At its worst, however, it basically just reflects an inner reactivity. That a person might say something that I feel some reactivity about, given my past relationships, my histories and things, and I'm thinking only about how I view them from my own context, from my own perspective. And that is one way to really get to know a person, because it's very, very much you and very much them kind of responding together as individuals, and you gain knowledge about one another and insight about one another. But to open up the way we understand others even more so, we can think about how they might see them as they see themselves. In addition, of course, to other things like how society might stereotype them, how we have reaction to them, things like that. Those things are also considered or paid attention to. sort of like process listening. We're paying attention to how we're paying attention to this person. We're watching the stereotypes that come up in our own minds. We're watching our own reactivity to the person, and so on. But we're also adding a layer there that's a little closer to how they might see themselves. Seeing someone as they might see themselves is really the bedrock of compassionate empathy. Compassion can be thought of as meaning literally feeling with. Same with, pretty similarly with empathy. And compassion, literally the words come, S-E-O-M, the prefix means something like with, and the term passion has historically meant basically some kind of inner feeling, inner sense. And it also has inflections of suffering at times too. Feeling passion taken away might be pleasant, might be unpleasant, so you're feeling with. And empathy literally feels with. The way we feel empathy is by processing our own inner bodily sensations, our emotional bodily sensations. Those feeling toned sensations that we talked about a couple of weeks ago when I asked you to pay attention to thoughts and feel, right? Thoughts and feelings, how we pay attention to certain types of thoughts that's happening in our mind, and then bodily feelings that reflect an emotional quality. That's what we do when we are empathic to another. When we have empathy for another, we actually feel it within our own bodies. We feel that emotion embodied within us. And in that sense, we kind of take the other person's place, in a sense. We feel the phrase, we're walking in their shoes, to the best of our ability. We obviously can't do that fully, and we're going to leave things out or misconstrue things. But the intention is a deeper understanding of who they are as they see themselves or as they experience themselves. Now, a large part of how those types of listening and those types of understanding actually take shape or play themselves out are through nonverbal communication means. And if you've been in my previous class, another class with the children with disabilities, or if I've talked with you in another class about this kind of thing, you probably heard me describe these types of nonverbal communication. And I think it's very useful to think of them or remember them in these ways because they put in a nutshell how we present ourselves non-verbally. Okay, so the way to remember this can be helpful to just point to or use different parts of your body to remember this. And this comes from some of Dr. Dan Siegel's work, who I've mentioned probably countless times by now. But you can remember by eyes or eye contact, facial expression, tone of voice, posture, gestures, timing, and intensity. And those are all ways you can remember just to scan your own presentation to another, but also to scan them to see what else is there that they might not be saying, reading in between the lines, so to speak. So where your eyes are looking, what they might look like, you know, the emotion surrounding the eyes, and that kind of overlaps with facial expression. You know, if they're saying one thing but their face says another, you can tell, and that means something different. Tone of voice obviously changes things, and that leads into what parts of speech we emphasize and what parts of speech we gloss over, and that gives us a different flavor of what's being said and what's being meant. Posture means a lot, or can mean a lot, and you can pay attention as people might cold shoulder you, for instance, a common kind of thing is like if a person is crossing their legs toward you, they're generally more engaged, and that's kind of on average. You don't have to cross your legs towards someone to be engaged. Timing of speech and timing of communication really matters a lot too, and also in intensity, how involved, engaged, impassioned, say, a person might seem by what they're saying. These are all ways to kind of soak yourself into what's being presented to you so that you can understand it as deeply as possible and with the fullest context possible. And they're useful because they're not always obvious, but they're always perceived. They might not be perceived consciously. So you notice every single time someone does one of these nonverbal, expresses nonverbal communication, it's there and your body registers it, so to speak. Your brain processes it, but might process it in a non-conscious way. And the purpose of this is to draw that up into your awareness so that you actually see it happening and you recognize it. So what I'd like for you to do in your practice assignment this week, which is going to be a discussion post and one reply to another student's discussion post, I'd like you to memorize the list that I have for you in the PowerPoint that I just went over. And what I want you to do with that is take a whole day, and this is an important part of what we're talking about in communication, because you actually have to put these things into practice in order to feel them out and then to allow them to become your new normal if you choose to. So take one whole day where you wake up and you go, I'm going to do this assignment this day, and the whole day I want you to do it. Okay, and it won't take the whole day. It'll be a little peppered into your day, so it won't be an hour-long assignment. But you can actually notice every time you enter into what I'm calling a social exchange. That means you and another person or a group of people are interacting in any way. Just brief glance of eye contact, a thank you very much at a register at a store, or the most, the deepest, closest relationship conversations that you have that day. And in all of those situations, during that situation, to the best of your ability, I want you to recite these ways of nonverbal communication to yourself. You don't necessarily have to try to scan or track all of those within yourself or within the other person. Just allow them to be on the working table in your memory, right? So that they're actually a part of how you perceive what's going on. I want you to actually keep a record of how many times you were able to recite them to yourself in that one day. And consider yourself, I mentioned, like a zoologist, as though you were a distant observer watching yourself and watching the other person through, tracking to a slight degree some of those nonverbal communication methods. So again, I don't want this to be encyclopedic. I don't want you to have to feel like you have to track every little bit, but bring those things to your mind so that you're having them, so you have them on your mind, and then try to notice a couple of them that shout out to you, right? So a person's tone of voice might just be obviously either unusual to you or emphatic or noticeable. Just make a mental note of that and try to keep track of them as you go. And try to write down some of the things that you notice, either in nonverbal communication or how it was for you to try to keep up with these in something like a social observation log. So the idea is, again, you're distancing yourself in a certain way to observe more of the circumstance, kind of like a bird's eye view of what's going on, and trying to view that each situation you enter into with thinking through in those nonverbals. All right, so we're going to dive in a little more deeply into active listening and the 5 essential components to it. In general, active listening can be thought of as taking the other person's frame of reference. So we're sort of subtracting ourselves out of the conversation when we're active listening. And that doesn't mean we're forgetting about our opinions totally, or we're letting ourselves be walked on. It doesn't mean any of that. It means that for that moment that you're actively listening, you're allowing yourself to be emptied out and allow the other person to allow you to be filled with the other person's experience. You're trying the best you can to be them in that moment, at least in your understanding of them. And in this way, it could be thought of to be listening with, not listening about. So you're not listening about this other person that's foreign and different from you. You're trying your best to be a part of their own experience so that you get more of them, okay, to the greatest degree possible. And so remember the 5 essential elements back from chapter 2 in the teacher's guide is pay attention, demonstrate that you're listening, or demonstrate that you're paying attention, provide feedback, defer judgment, and respond appropriately. So I'm going to go through each of these in a little more depth now. So I did want to make a note on the difference between providing feedback and responding appropriately. Feedback sometimes we can think of that as being some action that we take, but it's a little bit different than that. In terms of active listening, providing feedback actually means to simply highlight what you are listening, that you are listening, and how you understand it. So the feedback can be a simple nodding of the head. It's an active participation in your own reception of what they're saying. Okay, so it's no action on your part taken by putting your own opinion there or interpreting or anything like that. That falls under the category of responding appropriately. After you fully heard and to the best of your ability understood what the other person said, and you're providing feedback that you're doing that to them by eye contact, saying things like mm-hmm or yes or I get that or I understand that, and nodding your head, things like that, then you actually might respond appropriately. And response in this sense means the action taken by the listener only after you've heard and understood the best you can. And action can be speech, action can be of body, and action can also be of thought. So you're actually putting yourself back into the equation in responding appropriately. That's why it overlaps with active expression that we'll talk about next week as opposed to active listening. I've given you an example in the PowerPoint. If you are a professional or a teacher approaching a student crying at recess, after talking to the student who is crying, you might provide feedback showing that you are highlighting what you've heard them say or what you've understood by saying something like, let me make sure I understand you. You feel upset because you were left out of the game, right? And this is an example specifically of clarification that is a part of providing feedback. And so that's the feedback part. The response, the appropriate response that might be taken might be something like turning to the children leaving the student out and saying, it looks like you hurt this person's feelings. Let's think of a way that we can all play together so no one's left out. That's actually taking the information you got during listening and responding with it as appropriately as you can. All right, so the first element of active listening is pay attention. And that probably is pretty straightforward, that you actually have to be attentive in listening in order to actively listen. So being present is the main or central point of this. And the stance or the attitude that you might take might look something like a curious or open or accepting and engaging and interested attitude toward the person. And that can look a whole lot of different ways, but in general, that's kind of what it refers to. When you demonstrate that attention, right, so you have to actually make it obvious to them. You can do that with nonverbals, you can do that with silence, you can do that with a vocalization of some sort like mm-hmm, or that basically points to the fact that you're still listening, you're still there with them, you're still engaged, and you're still interested. It kind of keeps the thing going so that the other person knows they're not just pouring water down an empty well. They're actually being heard. Now, the providing feedback, there are several ways that we might do this specifically, and I've given you a list of some of them. Clarification and this can be a clarification of facts. So there are two types that we can think of. Clarification for the listener's sake. I'm actually confused, and I want to make sure that I hear this right. And the other type is clarification for the speaker's sake. So if it seems as though the person's sort of jumbled, especially in the sense of a young child, we might try to help them make sense of their experience, of what's happening to them. You might actually give them feedback by clarifying, let me get this straight, or let me make sure I understand you, or is this what you mean by this? And it could be for you as the listener, but it also can be so that they can understand themselves a little bit more. Another way of providing feedback is restating. And there are 4 types that you can think of. You can literally restate exactly what the speaker says. And sometimes you might do this just for emphasis, to especially a powerful phrase, An example of that, and I'm just thinking in the therapy world, for instance, if a person says to me, I feel so lonely, like if they say it with real impassioned feeling, I might say back to them the literal phrase they just said, I feel so lonely, and highlighting it and basically pointing at it and saying, I recognize how much gravity that has for you. I recognize how important that is for you. And another type is basically saying the same thing they did, but replacing the pronoun. So you feel so lonely, right? Pointing that back to them for the same reason, sharing the emphasis for it. Another type is partial restatement. So I feel so lonely might be restated as so lonely or feeling lonely or something like that, or in a partial way. And fourth type is actually to rephrase, to shape it in your own way. So I feel so lonely, I might reflect back to them. Being alone is really hard for you right now, something like that. Okay? So another way of providing feedback is reflection. And when we reflect, we're reflecting emotion of the person back to them, thinking of ourselves as an emotional mirror, and we're trying to listen behind the words that they're saying. Okay? And this is where empathy really comes in, because we feel, as a person says, I feel so lonely right now, with that same emphasis, we might feel a kind of drop in our stomach or an ache in the chest or something like that if we're really attuned to them. And when we do that, we can pour back to them exactly what we're feeling that they're feeling, right? So reflecting back to them, I feel so lonely is a hard one because they're actually really specific about what they feel. But if they say something else like, I don't know, I never feel like I'm around people, or people don't want to be around me, or something like that. That might be reflected back to them as in the form of saying, you seem to feel really lonely, or really alone, or really isolated. And you seem to feel is a really good way of starting a reflective statement like that. And that's especially really helpful for kids, because when they hear you say, you seem to feel, then you fill in that blank with your emotional reflection. Not only can they correct you if you're inaccurate, which is good. It's good if you're inaccurate and they correct you, because then you understand more. But it also allows them to see their own experience played out in front of them. And that's really enlightening to them, because they get to know themselves. Not only do they get to know themselves, they get to know how to let others know themselves. So reflection is a really powerful tool. It's a way of providing feedback to show them that you're with them, show them that you're understanding and caring, but it's also a way to build a new understanding of both people in the conversation or the exchange. And something else that can be a helpful way of providing feedback is validation. Validation doesn't mean that everything the person says is correct or that it's right. It just means that given their circumstances, given their context, given their history, it makes sense, right? So that the sense part is what's really central. And starting a validating statement with, it makes sense to me that, filling in the blank, is a really helpful way to start. An example might be something like, if you're approaching a young child who just lashed out at another student and even did something harmful to them, threw something at them or punched them or whatever, that's not okay. We're not going to validate the behavior as much as validating the overwhelm or the frustration that the student who lashed out felt. So it makes sense to me that you would really want to show that other student that you were mad, right? It makes sense to me that you reacted in some way because it hurt your feelings, right? That can be balanced with, however, we also don't throw things at other students. We don't put our hands on other students to harm them, things like that. Student feels like, okay, they get what's important about why I did that, and they also let me know that what I did wasn't appropriate too. Rather than just shutting the whole thing down. You should not do that, and that's that. You shouldn't, that whole thing was wrong, right? That's really what the message gives. What message is received when there's no validation there. Okay, so next week what we're going to talk about in more detail is this next part of responding appropriately. In a nutshell, it could be thought of as interpreting and explaining. And it serves an orienting purpose. That's what the explanation kind of can serve. And it's not from the stance of being know-it-all, right? Knowing everything about what the person's saying. But it might be an extension of clarification, but with your own take on it. Okay? So trying to make meaning out of what's going on, trying to provide them with a different type of understanding. So you're actually putting yourself back into the fold. You're not just allowing them to be actively heard. You're actually putting more of your thought into it. But we'll kind of go over that part of active listening in more detail next week. I did want to make one more note outside of what I've already covered about deferring judgment. So we all have to judge in life. We have to make discernment. We have to make decision, we have to draw lines. Those are all things we have to do. Otherwise, we'll just be stuck with no preference and no direction. We have to have self-direction, so we have to make choices. So sometimes, we have to make judgments a lot. Deferring judgment, this phrase, inactive listening, really refers to avoiding jumping to conclusions about a person and who they are, right? That's the key thing. We can use clarification to make sure we have things right. And even if we have it as clear as possible, we're avoiding making brash decisions about our own attitudes about the other person, or rash decisions about what type of person we think they are overall. Okay? And in this sense, a phrase comes into play that's really important, and that's unconditional positive regard. Okay, that's a phrase that you may or may not have heard, but it's a very common one, especially in the therapy world, but when dealing with children, this is very applicable. Unconditional positive regard does not mean that we assume everything a person does is good or right. Doesn't mean that at all. It means that we assume everything the other does, given their unique experience and perspective, actually makes sense and is a result of their trying to make their lives better, moving in a positive direction. Okay, and that's their direction that they found is in accordance to what meaning they found previously in their experience, right? So we're assuming that everyone's trying their best to be their best in a certain sense. And now that's not always true, unfortunately. But the lack of effort to make yourself better actually has a sense of understanding too, in a certain way. And I'm saying that, especially in my experience with clients in therapy, they sometimes enact self-destructive behavior, and that's obviously not aiming at their betterment. But there's something about that effort that, even if it's kind of subconscious, that presupposes they're aiming at something that will fix something, right? So their actually intention is to overall toward the better in a positive direction. That's what unconditional positive regard means. It's our own attitude, assuming that other people are aiming at a higher good of themselves. And when we approach people that way, they can tell, and it actually might help them get there and stay there. So the process of deferring judgment, the reason we do it is so that the speaker feels as openly received as possible, and so that the listener gets as much clear information without distorting it with their own impressions, their own opinions, without interfering with the message, changing what the person's trying to mean by our involvement in it, or premature interpretation, that is, trying to understand and sum up to oneself something that's being said before all the information's heard. Okay, so that's the important part of deferring judgment in active listening. We kind of suspend our judgment of the person and hear as much as possible about what their feelings and thoughts are, and use feedback and things to clarify as much as possible as well. So for your demonstrate assignment, I have 2 parts that I'd like for you to complete. The first is that I would like for you to purposefully utilize 3 elements that I covered, 3 things that I covered today: silence, reflection, and deferring judgment, right? So silence and reflection are both parts of aspects of active listening. So silence might be is a way that we might show a person that we're listening, right? That means we're not jumping in to put what we have to say in there as soon as possible. We actually leave space for the conversation to continue with their leading it. Okay? So when we use silence, we're not being silent and stoic. We're not cutting off and ignoring or falling silent when we're expected to reply. And that's been a point of confusion I've noticed from some of you. So silence is not that if a person asks us a question, we don't answer, right? That's more rudeness most of the time. Or it can express a certain sullenness or inquisitiveness or thoughtfulness. But what silence means in this aspect is if a person begins a sentence and there's lots of space, they don't quite know where they're going yet, right? Like I'm doing, then the idea of silence is not jumping in to fill that space as soon as possible. It's just pausing and letting them have that space, that time, to be able to come to their conclusion and state clearly what they're thinking and what they intend to say. It can be useful because it allows the other person to relax, so I don't have to say it all immediately before they interrupt me, right? So I want you to try to use silence. I want you to try to use reflection. That is, you seem to feel this way. I wonder if you felt this way. It's the emotional mirror to other people. And I want you also to purposefully use deferring judgment. Catch yourself thinking about another person like you've summed them up based on what they've said or done, and suspend that judgment of the other person or their line of action, and wait a little longer and try to get more details and more information through nonverbal means or through verbal means to try to understand them with more depth and fullness. Okay? I want you to use these three things in conversations in your own life. Right? You might do that while you're keeping up with the nonverbal, while you're reciting the nonverbals to yourself in the practice portion, so these things can overlap. But I want you to specifically use these three parts: silence, reflection, and deferring judgment. And then on the part two is to the best of your ability. I want you, like we've done in the past, I think one of the first weeks I asked you to make a movie script, just kind of one that you made up. I want you to actually try to reproduce a dialogue that you really had with someone else, where you tried using silence, reflection, and deferring judgment. And I want you to place the nonverbals you noticed in brackets. So if you're speaking with a person and you let silence be a part of that, and you notice them look around or look at you like they're expecting you to interrupt, maybe, like if you normally do, put those in brackets, like just describing their bodily language and things like that. And I want you to try to recreate that dialogue as fully as possible in written form and submit it as an assignment on Blackboard. Okay? So you have those two things, your practice and demonstrate assignment, and you also have two things to submit, the children's books annotated bibliography and the Festival of the Young Child activity description. That's by the end of the week, the 31st. No QQC this week, so take a little time off of that extra thing, and because you have a few other things going on this week with the practice and demonstrate and these two bigger assignments. There is a little bit of the self-reflection that I'd like to hear a little bit more about. This is a helpful extension for me to understand how you're experiencing what I'm asking you to do, since we're not meeting week to week in class, which I know is really difficult in a communications course. So this is a unique kind of platform to do this type of class with. So the self-reflection is helpful for me to keep up with where you are in this. Okay? All right, so sorry this was a long one, but I do want you to get all the details of what we're doing here, because this is actually when we're starting to practice these things. And I really want you to be able to practice them in a way that makes sense to you. And again, since I'm not there to field questions in a classroom, make sure you reach out to me if any of these things are not quite clear, so we can so you can get the experience that best serves you in this class. Okay? So the door's open if you need me. Get in touch with me if you need to, and remember those couple of assignments by Sunday. Have a good week.